Hey everyone, it's Motzie. Just dropping in to tell you that this week's episode has been delayed to give our team time to handle both podcast production and fulfillment for a fundraiser. But in the meantime, enjoy this interview from 2022 with the amazing radio drama revival with Elena Fernández-Collins, where I chat about Hainai, funny fun facts about horror sound effects, my experience in animation, and why animators/visual artists love podcasts, and Filipino Realities and all the gory details. Please note the warnings at the beginning. There's mention of parental physical violence and corporal punishment. And of course, thank you, we love you, and also, fuck Marcos.
Horror is more than just the white final girl riding off into the sunset, covered in blood. It's a genre booming with marginalized, oppressed, and colonized writers as a space to directly confront the violences they have suffered. We talk all that and more with Motzie Dapul right here on Radio Drama Revival. Hello, and welcome to Radio Drama Revival, the podcast that showcases the diversity and vitality of modern audio fiction. I'm your host, Elena Fernández-Collins. Today, you'll hear our interview with Motzie Dapul, creator of Hainai. Dapul works in 2D animation and produces queer Filipino comics. She's been involved in fiction across different mediums for many years and has spent all that time honing her skills across science fiction, fantasy, horror, and romance, usually all of them at once. Working in these fields means she's able to bring stories that reflect her own history, experiences, and culture to global audiences. Please note that we will discuss and mention instances of physical abuse, the Philippines' May 2022 elections, and the history of the Marcos family. Take care of yourselves.
Welcome to Radio Drama Revival, Motzie. We're really excited to have you here and to talk about Hainai and talk about horror and immigrant narratives and all this stuff.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Sorry. Us, the team, but me.
Yeah. Well, don't worry. We'll talk about your co-collaborator very shortly, actually.
Nice.
But first of all, let's talk about you. You've also worked in animation and comics for a long time. Mm-hmm. A really rich storytelling background. Tell us a little about how you got into animation, and in particular, how your work in these visual mediums has influenced your work in an audio medium.
Oh, absolutely. So, ever since I was a kid, I loved, drawing and stuff. So I got into animation about the time I was going to college. I enjoyed doing comics and doing, drawing stuff, which is basically just what happens when you're a kid and likes anime and likes American TV shows and everything. So that's basically, yes, where all the interest went. That's all, you gotta want to make your own manga, you want to make your own comics, that kind of thing. And yeah, and then when I found out from a friend of mine that there was an animation program in one of the top schools, I was like, okay, I'm going to get into that one. And of course, as with many parents, they're animation, arts, arts? What do you mean arts? But
what do you mean arts?
And they had this, not really an ultimatum, but they were oh, you can only do this if you can prove that this is going to be worth it. And I got a full scholarship. So they're okay, fine.
Wow, damn.
So
that'll do it.
Yeah, that'll do it. Exactly. And yeah, my dad was my tatay, my dad, he's just he went to the open house and he saw the cafeteria, which was super fancy, and is okay, you can go to this school.
Amazing. I love that it was the cafeteria that did it.
It's a good cafeteria, yeah. And
yeah, that's my favorite part.
Exactly. And yeah, like they let me. I went for like 3 years and a semester, and then I went straight into work right after. I worked at a studio in the Philippines for about almost 4 years, like 3 years, 8 months, and the most famous thing I animated on was My Little Pony, and yeah.
Wow. Mm-hmm. No shit. I had no idea.
It was like, I can't say like, it was fun in some ways, but in general, like animation is like a very hard like industry. And the only reason I kind of continued it into when I arrived in Canada. So I went to Toronto, I took a program, then I got like a work permit and everything. And then the only reason I went back into it in Canada is because even though it's still pretty tough, the pay got like 13 times the amount I was paid in the Philippines. So I was like, I can do this. I can probably do this.
I can probably live off of this money.
So yeah, I've been in that for a while. The comics were stuff that I did for myself because eventually animation just became work. And that's generally what happens. Yeah. When you're in a creative field, it's like, it's not really like people are like, oh, that sounds so fun. That sounds so creative. And I'm like, yeah, for someone else, I'm just doing the work. Yeah. So, I mean, comics were what I did then. And then, like that's basically, I still do them now. I'm going to TCAF actually soon, which is a Toronto Comics and Arts Festival. So I'm very excited about that. And yeah, like I've always loved telling stories. That's basically been my driving force, like whether it be through comics or through any other medium. I've written some stuff. I've written a lot of short stories. One book that I'm very like, it's okay. It's fine. It's of its time. And yeah, so I've always enjoyed like drawing and writing, and that's my job, but it's also just what I love to do.
Would you say that the changes in like how you adapted to like animation or how you progressed through your animation career and the changes that happened in like storytelling techniques or trends or anything influenced what you're doing in audio with Hainai? I
think it did. I actually think that because the thing you don't generally hear, but is like kind of a truth in a bunch of like animation, like among animators and a bunch of like visual artists, is that when animators are working, they tend to consume podcasts because the brain is like, visually like very engaged. So like, but many animators need an additional like thing of engagement. So like podcasts are the perfect thing. Podcasts or live plays of D&D, like those are the things that I'm noticing, like with myself and my peers. And yeah, that's why we love podcasts in the animation space. It's like a very interesting phenomenon.
I had wondered.
That's a big one. And yeah, and also obviously just like it's another, like it's kind of the other form of like the indie comic. Like the indie comic is so ubiquitous. It's like people like really telling what stories they want to the most, and like podcasts are similar. Like it's the way like people can get in and like tell the story that they want to tell in a way that's very accessible to a lot of people, a lot of creators. And I do think that especially with the way I do podcasting, the audio is kind of like, it's not secondary, but it is more like, I always think about it in my head. I have a very like visual way of like thinking, and I try to do the best I can to like translate that into audio, kind of like make sure that people can kind of understand what I'm seeing in my head. And so a lot of my way of doing podcasting is very like visually oriented, which has led to a lot of people telling me like, oh, a lot of podcasts are perfect as a podcast medium, but your podcast feels like it could be a TV show or like something like that. And I'm like, I kind of understand that because I do like see it as a TV show in my head. And I am basically just like breaking it down to something that can be understood in an audio medium. And like, and I have to, like make sure that it's convincing more than anything, because there are like certain aspects of the audio medium where people try to over-explain things. Whereas for me, it's like, you don't have to really over-explain things. You just have to make sure that things are clear. Like you don't have to, insist upon certain details.
if those details don't really matter to the overall like picture. Unless the details matter, you don't have to like go really into it. So I do like to do that. I like to have that sort of thing where I have a balance between like what I'm seeing in my head and what I'm like writing on the page and acting out. So yeah, I'm sure it all comes together. It's all like really, it's all connected.
You co-create Hainai with your collaborator Reg Helly.
Mm-hmm.
What does your podcast collaboration look like? Because we've seen a lot of like collaboration teams on Radio Drama Revival, and they all work very differently. And people are usually interested in seeing that process.
So our collaboration's interesting just because Reg Helly is my best friend of, gosh, I don't know how many years now, like 15 years, I think. Our friendship as a teenager, I think, is what we described it as. And yeah, like she's been my best friend for years. And the collaboration kind of came out of during the pandemic, both me and Reg got into the same podcast, and we would listen to it together on Zoom or like on Discord. We would like take a day, listen to an episode together, and kind of just chat about it. And once I started like pitching a lot of ideas to her, she would be the one not only to like bounce ideas off of, but then she'd be like, this one's a little too much. And it's like, you're right, this is too much. Or she asks a clarifying question and is like, okay, but what is this? And I'm like, I don't know. And it's just like, so it's been like, I like to like info dump on her on all of my ideas. And then she will like kind of take them and kind of like clean them up. Just be like a little too much over here, a little too much over there. And then, yeah. And once that whole process is done, we're like, okay, we have like agreed on this cut down version or like this like more like clarified version. And then we just kind of go from there. And Reg also handles a lot of the other aspects of Hainai, like making sure that she does the graphics for every episode and all that. And yeah, basically like Reg has been a wonderful collaborator, like in various things that cannot be put down on one page. So we just put her as co-creator. And yeah, this podcast definitely wouldn't exist without her. Although our backgrounds are very different. Like she is now like a medical student. So like that's a whole other like thing. But yeah, she loves this podcast as much as I do. She really like, we have like a lot in common in terms of our inspirations. So yeah, it's been like wonderful to collab with her. Even though we're both like busy at various times, it still works out.
So Hainai was specifically written for the magical person of color who is often relegated to being a background trope to a white protagonist, who now gets to be their own protagonist with a like BIPOC surrounding cast and people they trust to support them, which is also often not the case. Talk to me about your experiences with this trope in animation and comics and what the process of reclaiming it for Hainai looked like.
Oh, interesting. I think animation has a lot of people who are like, doing a lot of like very visionary things. I'm thinking of like things like Owl House, and I'm thinking of Amphibia and all that, and like BIPOC characters being able to kind of like come center stage a little bit. And I always found it really funny in like horror media, like in, I guess, film and like stuff like that, where you'd have this like cast of white characters who are going through this, and then they go to this person who's like this non-white person who knows what's going on, and for some reason that non-white person doesn't stick around. Like they don't, sometimes because like, whoa, they died because like this happened, and I'm like, okay, whatever, cool. But sometimes just like they just don't stick around, and it's like it's almost like you have like a fire extinguisher for a fire, and then you just like, here's the fire extinguisher, anyway, let's go into this fire and figure it out.
Yeah.
Like okay,
someone bring a bucket of water, I guess.
Yeah, it's like, or not even, they're just like, oh, here's the fire extinguisher, and then they're like, anyway, how do we deal with this fire?
Yeah. Like they literally just really?
Yeah, it's just like, it's just right there, It's like, it's right there. It's very funny to me, and they're there to help, and then they just like, it's either they just don't come up again, or they give instructions and then the main character is just straight up like, don't listen. And they're like, what? It's like, she just told you what to do. Like, what are you doing? So I wanted to incorporate that. So kind of going back to High and High a little bit, I kind of want to incorporate that because I like the idea of, and especially just in general horror, like barring like any of those social like considerations, just in general horror, it's best if the person does all the smart things and still like sees misfortune. And it's kind of like that's the best kind of horror. It's like they do everything they can and there's still like a lot of like real threat. And whether you like a bad ending or a good ending, it's always most satisfying when the protagonist does everything right. And there's still like something that could go wrong. And kind of like I wanted to incorporate that in High Night because Mary spends a lot of like her time kind of just giving instructions. And
she do be doing that.
Yeah, she's like, she kind of just knows what to do for the most part. And the fun part about her is that despite, kind of fulfilling that role of like knowing what's going on, because she's also the youngest in the entire cast, when she doesn't know what's going on, she actually has like a little bit of a crisis when she doesn't know what to do. And like I think that like gives her a lot of like really interesting character. Like she seems very responsible and very like knowing about a lot of things, but she is like she does still need help in a lot of other cases, which is why she has like such a nice team around her.
So you discussed in an interview with Doitano on the Comics Cube about how you were surprised people found your work terrifying and you thought you were just leaning into the creepiness. Do you have any thoughts about the disconnect there and why it might have happened?
Good question, because I do think it was, I think it's like, I guess it comes down to effectiveness because I've realized we're kind of surprisingly effective at certain things. Like I can just make a sound and people are like, ew, like, don't do that. And I'm like, what? It's just my mouth doing this sound. And I kind of just like do the sound and everyone's like, stop. And I do think it does come down to, I am creeped out by many things. Like I'm a scaredy cat. I can't play horror games except like really baby ones. I get like such a like my heart starts like beating fast and
why is everyone in horror like this?
And that's the interesting. I think that like I think I kind of know why, and it's very fun because I was like a scaredy cat when I was a child. I can watch more horror movies now, but back then I was like I could not watch a single horror movie or else like have nightmares for weeks. And I like watching people play horror games, but I can't play horror games myself. And yeah, it's like I think it's because and I think many people in horror are like this. It's that, like kind of you're not scared of what you like know, and people write what they know. And nothing about this is like unusual to me. I'm like, okay, here's the rotting thing. I know how it's supposed to sound. Here's what I'm going to do. And I know like what the source of the sound is too. So I find it like, in my opinion, it's like kind of funny. Like the rotting thing specifically, people were very scared of that sound. And that sound is like, I don't know, I think it was like a stomach rumbling and I just slowed it down like a lot. Like some very genius man had done this like free library of like sound effects, and one of them was just putting a microphone up to his stomach as it was like rumbling. And I was like, this is great. And I just started like putting it through a bunch of filters and being like, okay, this is my monster. So like that kind of like wipes like the horror off of it. It's very fun, kind of just the process makes it like less scary. You're kind of just listening to it over and over and you're like, okay, I need to make this scary. So you're working from a point of not scary and you're trying to make it creepy, and you're like, okay, I think this is creepy enough. But people just kind of get into it like they are already in this mindset of like what the horror is. So like the sounds kind of like take them off guard and it like scares them. And I kind of find that really fun. Like I've definitely like, if I knew how PT was made, like Silent Hill PT, I'm sure I wouldn't be scared of like the lady who's floating around, but I don't, and therefore every time I see her I'm like, no. And I also like, I do think that even if something's not necessarily scary, when you're in the zone, when you are invested in something, it doesn't matter if it's scary or not, because you know that it's the threat of death or failure or like like you've kind of like psyched yourself up. You have put yourself in the position of being scared. And so, yeah, like, I think that's like what it is. Everyone in horror is like creeped out by everyone else. And it's kind of just very funny to see, like, oh, that's so scary. Like, but that's so scary. But,
Amazing.
Mm-hmm. I just want to add, like, there's one scene in one of our episodes where I don't know if you've heard the Tick Tick episode, but that one's like a special episode, and like it does a sound and people think that sounds scary. But the sound is just something like I do with my mouth. So it's kind of sound like, and I just do that like behind my teeth. And I just like really enjoy that because people are like, oh, it's so creepy. It's like, and I'm just like, doing a tongue thing. Like, it's not that.
It's not that creepy.
It's not that creepy.
What are y'all talking about?
Yeah.
It's fun. I get ASMR from sounds like that.
Nice.
So like you started making the sounds and like I got like warm chills like all up my neck. And that's like a good thing for me. So
that's wonderful. I think some people were like creeped out by the concept too. And I'm like, I can't take credit for that concept. Fair. That's very much a Filipino like folklore thing. And I love it.
Yeah. Awesome. Actually, speaking of Filipino folklore, Mari is part of a Babaylan family and learned what she knows from her mother. I'd like to hear more about the Babaylan in the Philippines, especially for anyone who may still be picturing them as like the standard priestess trope or like just thinking of them as like shamans from like a completely different culture.
Absolutely, yeah. So I can say that it's different wherever you are. But I think like a lot of people see them a certain way, and honestly, it's not quite that. It's I actually can't say like what their day jobs are, if any, because I haven't like been in close contact with Babaylan that much. But my mom, which is really funny because like, I call this Hi Nai and it's Hi Mom, and she's kind of the inspiration for a lot of it, because when I was growing up, and I didn't like clock this as odd until like much later. When I was growing up, whenever like something strange would happen, she would have somebody, she'd call an albulario, which is a medicine man. And like she just called an albulario in, and I'm like, okay, cool, interesting. And then she would call like she has something called a hilot, which is like, at first it was just like an independent massage therapist without any of the, I guess, medical degrees or anything. And I'm like, okay, cool. Then I found out later, like, hilot is a form of, like, old medicine in the Philippines. And the hilot she's calling in are, like, kind of similar to the babaylan and the albulario, except they do, like, body, like, healing. So it's specific to them. And so I was like, okay, so my mom actually has like a lot of these like connections, and I just didn't realize it. And I talked to Reg about this, and even she was like, oh, my mom too. And they kind of come from the same area. They're like kind of more southern, like they're more in Visayas, which is like a more southern region of the Philippines, but not fully south. And there are a lot of people who are very active, and not just like not like in different areas. And for the most part, like they're not gonna look that different. Like the albulario I met when I was really young, I remember him, he had like a big beard, but other than that, he was like wearing a really loose shirt, and he was wearing like basketball shorts and like slippers, and he was just doing his thing. And I'm like, I feel like the big beard even was like just his thing. Like it's not something you see for everyone. I think it's probably part of his like whole thing. But yeah, it's like it's not really a dead art. It's very preserved, but not in any official capacity. So it's not so much that, here are the most famous babaylan, or like most famous shamans, or most famous like albulario or anything. Like here, it's more like, do you know somebody? And they'll be like, I know, like my cousin knows somebody, and you kind of just get in contact with them through family members, or like even like people who work at your house, like a maid or a driver. You're like, do you know somebody? And they'll be like, oh yeah, I know somebody. And it's kind of just a very communal thing where you just get in contact with them if you have a problem. that feels very supernatural. And it's for me, obviously, like I grew up in the city, and I'm obviously like here in Canada, so I am not like an expert on these things, and people have done way more research and done way more like informational like stuff than I have. Mine is like partially I mean, obviously it's very fictional, but at the same time, it also has like a grain of like truth in terms of all of the practices I have listed for Mary, or almost all of them, are based on real practices, whether they are old and they don't do that anymore, or they're like newer. I believe that there's this thing called a ling ling o, which Mary wears, which I also wear. And this one, they said to me, like, when I was asking about it, like, because I bought it, like, from people who were buying it straight from the mountains, like, people who were, like, carving it in the mountains, indigenous, like, groups. And they told me, like, oh, you know, like, if it was, like, genuine, they would have, like, dipped it in blood and, like, did some this and that. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And they still do that today. So there's a lot of, like, practices that I got just from, you know, research, just from, like, hearing about it, or people who have done more research than I have. But for the most part, it's like, it's still a living thing. And I don't know that there are people who live in like cities who have that job and then have no other job. I don't 100% know, or maybe it's case to case basis. Mari's mom, her nanay, she did that, but I imagine she had other jobs, you know, like it's like kind of her side gig. And her nanay, which is Mari's lola, also did that, like, and over time, like Mari herself, like she did the thing, but also she is a sound editor. That's her job. Like that's her day job.
Love that.
And like it kind of like lends itself to, I do believe they had like other parts of their life, but whenever they're called in, they're like, okay, I'm gonna like go here and do this thing and then come back and just do my day job and continue on. And that's kind of like the framing I have for Mari and her family.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I just always get so annoyed when people are like, nobody does that anymore. I'm just kind of like,
like so many people do that still. Yeah.
I know. I'm just kind of like, listen, you didn't kill all of them.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank God.
Exactly. It's like, and even in that, like a lot of them, you know, there's a little bit of Christianization there, but it's still like, yeah, people still like go up there. You can find all of these people like selling pendants in front of a church. Like, so that's literally where they are. Like they're selling all of these herbal remedies and or like lucky pendants, anting-anting and agimat, which are like essentially like magical objects that imbue power into you. And they're all like, you can buy them in front of like one of the oldest churches in Manila. Like, oh yeah, amazing. Like I need some magic, some very not Catholic magic in front of the Catholic church. Yeah. That's kind of just how it went. That's how it goes still now.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah.
I'm from Puerto Rico. That sounds familiar.
Exactly. Yeah. Very much like a similar vibe. It's
very similar vibe.
Mm-hmm. They didn't wipe out the beliefs. They kind of just integrated them.
One of the sources of Hainai's horror is, as you mentioned, Filipino folklore and this familial storytelling, which is baked into the whole concept of the show, where Mari tells her mother her adventures. This is a really close, beautiful relationship, both with stories and with family. Can you tell us a little about family dynamics in the Philippines and whether you've encountered anything radically different in Canada?
I guess like in terms of the Filipino family dynamics, I don't think I've like met that many, I guess, Canadian families. Let's just say that, like, because obviously I came here for school then work. So there's no like situation where I would have been up close and personal with a whole family or anything. Kind of just like different people, different individuals. But I do get like a sense of like what Canadian families look like, just in terms of, you know, media, just the general North American vibe, and also just like just what people tell me, like how they grew up and everything. And in the Philippines, like in a lot of like immigrant stories, the vibe is very different. Although I will say, like, of the families, my family is fairly liberal in that structure. Although I guess we weren't always, so that's interesting. Like my parents were extremely strict, extremely traditional, like way back when I was a kid. And as we got older, they became a lot more like loose, a lot more liberal, a lot more like chill. In the Philippines, it's very similar. Like the family tends to be very family first can be a toxic thing. Like not always, but in general, like the relying on family, and families are very big too. Like their entire communities in the Philippines. So these are all like familiar thoughts. And for Maddie and her like family dynamic, it's kind of unusual because I have positioned her as a character who doesn't have any siblings, which is kind of unusual, honestly. Her father actually, he passed away like kind of halfway through her life, so she only has her nanay, but she does have like a lot of cousins, so there's that. But yeah, like she has a slightly unusual one, but I still did like give her some interesting like dynamics with her mother that you kind of see as time progresses. Like clearly, you know, from the beginning that she loves her nanay very much, and she likes to tell her a lot of things. But as we go on, like I don't know if some people will react to this, but there are moments where Maddie kind of like tells a story and she kind of talks about how her mother hits her, and her mother is like very strict, and her, you know, like things like that. And she says it in passing because you know, like growing up in the Philippines, it was very common to get like essentially like smacked. Like it was very common to get like something, the cinturon or the belt, and we also get the chinelas or the chancla, the slipper.
Chancla. Yeah, chancla. Yeah. That's the one in PR.
Exactly. Yep. So like growing up, like that was kind of normalized for her, and it's just like that's how she would discipline her. And I never try to make it seem like she does it like unreasonably. In every like scene that it happens, it's kind of like because Maddie does a stupid thing or she puts herself in danger, which is generally like how I kind of remember growing up. But it is like, I think, complicated. I think it might be a little more complicated for a lot of people to kind of reason with, because this is just cultural as well. And it isn't like nowadays, not so much. But when I was growing up, it was just whatever. It was normal. So I put that into the story as well. I don't know. People haven't like commented on it. I don't know how they receive it. But I do think that on a global scale, I think a lot of people from our global audience kind of understands it. Like it is very much like it's not something to kind of be like, oh my God, like what the hell? It's more like this is part of the relationship and kind of like contributes to how like not necessarily like it's kind of fraught in some ways, but at the same time you can still see Maddie kind of just talking to her mom all the time. So it's like an interesting dynamic of why is Nanay the most important, like kind of low-key the most important character in this podcast, and like all that. So it's interesting, and it's also like when you kind of like look into it from a Filipino perspective, there are certain things that people kind of allow, and because there are quote unquote more important things to worry about. And yeah, like that's a complex like kind of topic that we want to like let is difficult to kind of go into, but it is like very genuine to kind of portray. And I think we try to do that
absolutely.
as well in Hainay.
Yeah, I think that that's a good choice, because I think ignoring those complexities does a disservice, right? Yeah. To like the like realities that you are trying to portray here. Exactly. When I say her nanay hits her, it kind of sounds like she punches her. No, she slaps her. Which is like, it's still hitting, but you know, like I don't mean to say like, oh, she punched her out, or no, that's not what happened. But she does slap her like in her memories and everything. So that's something like just to note, because it does happen. Like I grew up with it. It was kind of just like it is absolutely a form of abuse, but it's also absolutely like it kind of like the culture, the nature of like the whole situation. It was a very different like mindset, very different time, and it's not really something that can be kind of simplified because of different like cultures. So it's a whole other thing. Yeah. But yeah, like that's kind of just like my thought on it. Like I portrayed it, but not necessarily because I think Nana is a bad person. I just think like it's very important to have that kind of, because Nana she influenced Mary so much, and she
and they were put in very dangerous situations like all the time. So everything Nanay did was like kind of to protect Maddie in that way, and it kind of becomes clearer and clearer as time goes on why that's the case. Yeah,
absolutely.
Hello, my lovely audience. This is a quick break in our programming to highlight our presenting sponsor, Evo Terra's The End newsletter. The End is a fiction audio newsletter that highlights completed series and seasons, ready for you to enjoy at your own pace and without having to wait for more episodes. Evo has been in the podcast industry for 18 years and has excellent judgment for both independent and non-independent audio. Check out The End at theend.fyi and subscribe now to get your fiction podcast itch scratched with completed stories. And now, back to our show.
Well, let's talk about the real monsters, which are the colonizers and the white people.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Colonizers and white people are often the monsters in fiction written by people of color and colonized folks.
Yes.
Can't imagine why. Something that white folks love to claim is reverse racism, which doesn't exist for anyone listening who is not aware of that fact. What is crucial about putting them in this antagonist role? And no, you know what? That's it. What's crucial about it? Why is it so important?
Interestingly, I think like it in Hainai, I think a lot of people might be turned off by the idea that like the enemies, the antagonists are like almost like they're all white, although even if their group was not like necessarily all white. But that's kind of just like I didn't like intend for it to just be, oh, the white people are evil because white people are evil. No, not really. No, that's not really the intention. The intention was that the time in which they lived, of course, like this group of rich magicians would be white. Like, I mean, come on. Like whenever people are like, why is there like a black person in this Victorian thingy? I'm like, because history, but also, like now I'm like, oh, here's like a group of white people from like the Edwardian era. And they're all like bad guys. It's like, why? And I'm like, I guess you wanted history, right? Like this is, you want an all-white history, here you go.
I hate to break it to you.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, like the interesting thing, we do like play with this one other character, and she is the only character in, I would say like the Hainai podcast, and in like, she's the only character in the group, which we call the Ordo, which we'll go into later. But like the Ordo was like an old group of essentially like very magician, very much like inspired by a lot of like those occult groups like of the like 20s, 30s, 40s, that kind of thing. And they were, and like fraternities and things like that. And they're kind of like the main antagonists of Hainai. And like their magic and their like plans and everything. And I actually really enjoy these characters. I do think that some of them are like really intriguing, and I do like to humanize them in a lot of ways. But one of the members is the only member that they have that is black, and she's also a woman, and she was like she was based slightly on like real members, like real people that I had researched, which is that there was this guy in Canada, I can't remember his name right now, but he was like a millionaire through his through hotel chains. Like he had his like own hotel chains back in the 20s and 30s, like way late 1800s, early 1900s, and he was black, and so his family was like one of the most like nouveau rich like people of that era. And I kind of like had this character who is like, she is rich, and so she like enters this like group because she's actually like very good at like, she's very adept at like the research and the magic. And we kind of play with that as well. Like, what does that look like? Like who accepts her, who doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that the way race and like ethnicity in Hainai is presented is very much like an exploration, not so much as like, oh, like, I don't want to like oversimplify anything. A lot of it, I like to joke. Like I like to oversimplify it as a joke. Like, oh, look at all these like white enemies and like these like really good non-white people. But that's like kind of just a joke, not to shorten like what the concept actually is, which is that these characters are not necessarily bad because they're white. They're bad because they're rich. No, no, it's that's the real answer. The like what their evil is not in their color of their skin. It's the fact that they have money. No.
Yep. No notes.
But yeah, like
capitalism is the real enemy.
Capitalism is the real enemy, and that's like the whole point of High Night. No, I wanted to play with like these concepts of people who, I don't know, like they like have a different mindset that I've observed. It's like the mindset of rich people, the mindset of very often white people who just like don't understand like the consequences of certain actions. And I think like that's basically like the whole thesis of High Night in terms of the villain side, which is that a lot of them had very lofty ideals, and they're not even like, not all of them were like selfish is the thing. A lot of them were like, we're going to help people, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And so I tend to frame them like, that's why the main enemy is called the benefactor, because like he genuinely wanted to help people, and like we kind of like dig into why he's like this now, or like what this is what is happening in High Night, that he is like the biggest enemy. Like, why is a guy called the benefactor literally the biggest bad guy? And so we kind of like play into that, kind of like play into white savior tropes, like all different tropes in media that I think are interesting, but from a kind of horror perspective. And interestingly, like the way I did like the main characters, I like to say like, oh, here's my BIPOC cast and here's like all this and that. But I just do that because marketing, like honestly, it's like, here's like, okay, like here's what you need to know in like 5 seconds. Like the cast is all BIPOC and queer, the enemies are this and that, and like this is what's happening, it's in Toronto, da 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 da. Just so people who are interested in that kind of story can find it very easily. But the actual like content of the story is more interested in like the different like very human like elements of what like of like hubris, of empathy, etc. And the cast being like almost entirely non-white except for like Laura, who's like one character. That was by accident. Like that was like I like
love it when that happens.
It was like on purpose that like the main character is Filipina, because that's like, oh, I need her to be like this magical person who is not white, who is still like the main character. But everything else was kind of just like, I had a group of friends and they're all not white, and we were like, can you help me voice this cast? And they're like, sure. And we just started like designing characters that they could voice, and that's it. You know,
that's it. Just happenstance.
Exactly.
But I wouldn't say complete happenstance.
It kind of just fits into like the whole thing, but it wasn't like the intention from the get-go to be like, oh, we can only have non-white heroes and white villains. Like that was not the intention at all. It's just in the story.
Also, white people love to tell us about how they have that one black friend, so you know. It's just
exactly
the way the ratio works. I guess
like the one white, yeah, like Laura is the token white character in and
gotta have one of those.
We love her. She's great. Anyway,
yeah, she is great. So let's talk a little bit about the Philippines, because recently the Philippines held an election that was stolen by Marcos Jr., the son of Ferdinand Marcos, who was a dictator who was removed from power about 30 years ago, 30 plus years ago. Tell us in brief what happened, and if you find somewhere to mention it or talk about it, the impact of the filter of the Western media lens on what was happening in the Philippines.
Oh, absolutely. So recently, like there was an election and Marcos Jr. won the election, quote unquote. I mean, despite like being having like grounds for disqualification since the very beginning, that the COMELEC, which is the Commission on Elections, ignored, and then they let him campaign, even though again like more grounds for like being disqualified, which were ignored. There was proof of vote buying, which was ignored. It's like the COMELEC kind of just let him do what he wanted, and then he won. And I actually do think that if it was a legitimate election, he still would have won, but that would have been like, but there's a reason for that. And I don't think this was a legitimate election because 6 people were killed in election related violence and 1,800 machines were like broken on the day, and people could not cast their vote before the deadline that COMELEC would not like extend, even though it was because their machines were broken. There were supposed lock boxes that were not lock boxes. They were cardboard boxes. All that stuff, people have like kind of talked about this over and over, and it's kind of just like all very silly and very bad. But I will say, like I said before, I do think that even if it was legitimate, which I don't think it was, he still would have won because he paid like for quite the complicated and very like sophisticated what do you call it, like troll farms,
smear campaign.
Exactly, like he very very long campaign of misinformation. Troll farms who have come forward, essentially like people have like openly admitted to working for like troll farms by the dozens, making hundreds of fake accounts just to pretend that he's like a good leader. It was very like it was very much a coordinated misinformation campaign, erasing a lot of history, even though like all the historical sources, all the historians, all of the people who are like holding on to this information still have that information available. It is just that they were actively delivering misinformation to people. So it's been like, and that's kind of like what their goal is now. It is like they want to continue delivering this misinformation to people. Many people believe that misinformation, but also many people who don't care. They just think that they will benefit from another regime. And and essentially, just for people who don't know about Marcos, like Ferdinand Marcos is in the Encyclopedia Britannica. That'll give you like a good chunk of what he was. He was an authoritarian. He was a kleptocrat. He stole like a lot of money from the Philippines that his family has not like paid. Even now, even though he's gonna be president, quote unquote, BBM, like who is Marcos Jr., he still owes he and his mom still owe like $300 million for contempt of court. Yeah, like plus like a some kind of like tax of like 18 billion, I believe. It's like it's all stuff like people argue about the 18 billion, but nobody can argue about the $300 million. It's all very silly. It's all very like, I'm sorry, no, the 18 billion is the 203 million. He owes 200 billion in taxes. It's a lot of, but he owes billions of dollars. He owes billions of pesos, millions of dollars. And people just like, I don't know, like, whenever you kind of present that to them, one of them they can argue against, the other one they can't argue against, they just don't care. And it's like, all right, okay, whatever. Like, you think that Britannica, like the Encyclopedia Britannica is fake news. I don't know how to help you. It's like, and it's a range of people. It's a range of people, and it's crazy, but like we still have hopes. We still have like our work cut out for us. The people who are historians, who are like actual like journalists, they are holding the line as best as they can. We don't know what'll happen, but we do know that like the Marcoses are like very much, they lie quite a bit. And at this point, the interesting thing is, I mean, obviously, I cannot, pretend that it's a good idea to kind of belittle him but I don't believe that BBM is even like very intelligent. I think he's being manipulated. But I cannot, I cannot safely say that because obviously we cannot like pretend that he is just like a pawn, because that would be diminishing his role in like essentially a regime. But I do think that the mastermind here is Imelda Marcos, who is, by the way, a convicted criminal. She's just not in jail because she's old and they think she's too old to go to jail. And I'm like, No, send her to jail. She's got 7 convictions of something called graft in the Philippines. So it's like, send her to jail. She's been convicted since 2018. And literally they're like, where's the conviction? And I'm like, it's right there. Like, the news is right there. Like, they want to pretend like they're kind of like blind to the fact that she's been convicted. They're both convicted criminals. It's like, But yeah, like, it's at this point, it's
Very
like,
fun.
What can we do? Like, people will not like to hear this. Like, people in the Philippines, like, Filipinos will not like to hear this because they really think they're right. But honestly, like, it is so easy to see that they're both convicted criminals who owe like billions of pesos. And honestly, like, voting for a thief, like, I don't know. Like, I really hope you guys like get your money stolen because that would be like the best karma. The only problem is the people who did not vote for him are also going to have to deal with it. So I'm like,
Yep.
yeah. It's a lot of selfishness going around. But yeah, that's basically what it is.
Yeah.
His family stole a lot of money. There was a lot of torture, a lot of death. There was a lot of like horrible things that were happening. His mother was just as much a dictator as his father. He himself still owes a lot of money. Just because I wouldn't say is like the worst person in their family, but he's certainly very bad. And yeah, it's a whole thing. It's... And people will always be like, oh, if you speak out about it and you're not Filipino, they're like, you don't know shit. And I'm like, I know shit. You don't know shit.
Yeah.
Literally. It's so silly. But yeah, it's all very much like if they can't win an argument, they just say, move on. And I'm like, no. No, you can't move on from history. You can't move on from like from facts. Sorry about that. But yeah, that's basically what I have to say.
Yeah, I feel like yeah, I feel like a lot of our audience in the US is gonna understand the vibe of a lot of this.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Everybody looks at 2016.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And honestly, it's
just
and I think like the biggest problem with like Western media covering it is not that they're covering the truth, which I think is good. Like the fact that they're covering the truth is good. I think that a lot of just random people truly believe that it was kind of like the will of the people, by the will of the people that this happened, whereas like the actual truth is that a lot of people were just straight up lied to, and maybe half those people don't care that they were lied to, but there are like quite a number of people who either were lied to, and there are like people who are threatened with violence if they don't do what it is that like the family of a dictator wants. So that's kind of like how it is. It's like in the US, I believe like a lot of people like dismiss the concerns of people in the South just because the South is like, you know, has a large majority of people who are like very pro like Republican, some stuff like that. But it's kind of a similar thing in the Philippines where there are quite a few people who just cannot do otherwise, and there are quite a few people who are just terrible people. But they're like, that's not the entire country. And there are like 15 million plus people who voted for the opposition. And what they're doing is that they're just going to form a 15 million strong, like, what do you call it? Like service, non-government organization that focuses on bettering the lives of people in poverty. And that's what's going to happen. And that's why people are so hopeful, even with everything that's been happening. But it's also been very fun just to see the people who are like very well-respected historians and like people in government and everything who have literally like cussed out Marcos, just being like, it was very fun. And I was
very
savage, very
How would you say that the Philippines past and now present with dictatorships and fascism inform Filipino fiction?
Ooh. Filipino fiction is interesting because that is kind of like a very good lens by which we know what's going on in the current situation. And you can see that with the Duterte administration, which I would also consider kind of a dictatorship. Mm-hmm. But
absolutely,
essentially, like you can see kind of this fight between two factions of media. and one is the pro Duterte media and the other one's the anti Duterte media, and they're both fighting essentially. Like in film, especially, I was seeing it like here's a film for Netflix that is very anti Duterte, and here's a film for Netflix that's very pro Duterte, and they're both on Netflix. What are you gonna do?
Amazing.
It's so odd, but I do find that obviously like grassroots groups and like, you know, small like actual like communities of artists are very much anti-fascism in general, and the only ones who are kind of pro-fascism kind of are not welcome into those communities. And even like it wasn't even that old, like I don't know if you know Budgetan. He is the creator of Trece, which is a animated series on Netflix.
Yes, you talked to. This is the thing that you started talking about in the Comics Cube interview that I mentioned earlier. Yes.
Budget is great, and he created Trece. And interestingly enough, in Trece, the main antagonist is like, you know, this old warrior, war god and stuff like that. But in the comics of Trece, the actual main antagonist of the whole like overarching story of Trece is Imelda Marcos. Well, I mean, I can't say she's Imelda Marcos. She's the madam who looks like Imelda Marcos. She left the Philippines and came back because her family was driven away. And she pretends...
I can't imagine who this is.
And she pretends to be very nice to people while also, like, essentially making arrangements to, like, get a bunch of people killed, etc., etc. It's all...
I can't imagine who this could be. Clearly, he just made it up from his brain.
Yeah, absolutely. Like,
there's no one who fits this description at all.
Exactly. And there's like, it's very funny. Like, if you look this up, it's like the Madame Trece. That is the main antagonist of Trece, and you'll be like, huh, looks familiar. I wonder who this is. And yeah, like, I mean, Budget, like, he is very interesting. He is very much not quiet about how much of Trece like reflects like real life, and having his main antagonist be basically Imelda Marcos is like a very big statement for him. And similarly, there is another comic by the artist of Trece, who is Cadjo Baldissimo. So there's a comic called 1201, like 12, like time 1201. It's a martial law story by Russell Molina, who is another like really great creator of comics in the Philippines, and Cadjo Baldissimo, who is the artist of Trece. And 1201 is very much a martial law era comic. It talks about how the curfews meant essentially people could disappear and be killed. And a lot of people just lost their family, like lost people to just these curfews. And it was very, you know, it's a very triumphant comic. It is basically about a group of people who go out after curfew just to perform. But it is like, it kind of like taps into one of the biggest fears of the martial law, which is that if you go out after a certain time, you die. Like, that was the fear. A lot of people were just getting kidnapped off the streets and like never seen again. And that's part of like what martial law was. And we actually have one of our episodes of Hainay covers that. There is, so Hainay episode 11, Nakaraan, it covers Mary's dad, or Mary's tatay. And it's one of his like horror stories, except that it is a mix of an urban legend that I've heard very commonly in the Philippines, but it's also a mix of the actual horror of this story. Is that Mary's dad grew up was kind of a young adult or teenager during the martial law era. And the concept of the story is that he is afraid of like this strange ghostly apparition that's happening to him. But more importantly, he's afraid of being out past like curfew time during martial law. And that's like the actual fear that he has, rather than this creepy thing that's happening to him. And
ghosts are not as terrifying as martial law.
Exactly.
Get in line.
Exactly. Fiction is interesting because it kind of like reminds you in a way that's like, you know, that kind of entertains you in some way, like, you know, like, oh, this is entertainment. But then it kind of makes you curious about like what actually went on, and then you see that the reality was much worse than what you are given in this horror story.
Yeah. Speaking of realities that are worse than the fiction, we're finally seeing a lot more immigrant narratives in published fiction, including horror. What, in your experience as an immigrant in Canada, informed Mottie's story?
I would say that a lot of Maddie's story is, it's interesting. Like, I don't think I have experienced fully like what Toronto is quite yet. Like, I do think it's more now than ever, because now that people are like kind of coming out and we're seeing what Toronto is, and it's a city, and cities are fun in a people shouting at 2 a.m. kind of way. And I do think that my immigrant story with Maddie is more informed by the horrors of back home than it is about the horrors of Canada. I think, actually, now that I think about it, the reason that Maddie is so capable and like she's so like, oh, I could not handle this, this and that, is because I don't find, or at least I used to not find Canada that scary. Nowadays, I'm like seeing a little more. I'm like, okay, I see where this horror is, and I'm like grasping onto the horror like potential of Canada. But back then, it was very much a very benign place for me, coming in as an immigrant, kind of just like, doing my own thing. And Maddie was like kind of came from a background that was very horrific, and then going here and seeing like horrible things, but being like, it's fine. Not that, she's like, it's okay. It's whatever. And that's fine. That's kind of like where her attitude comes from. Like, obviously there's a whole plot and there's terrible things happening and, all that. But like her whole thing is like, like, I think I know how to handle this. And, slowly as I get to know Canada more, I think I'm making Mary a little more like, worried. But as it began, it was very much like Canada feels very safe in a lot of ways, in comparison to what she came from and what I came from. So like that was like the attitude that I had with Maddie, like being, she's like, she knows how to handle this because she's already gone through like so much crazy stuff that she knows how to deal with. And I think the nice development of Hainai is that she is slowly not being able to deal with everything and kind of like having to rely on other people. That's kind of like a nice way to like frame like the original, like the beginning of Hainai, which is that, Maddie's like seen it all and she's like, it's whatever. She just doesn't, she's very, very, nonchalant about a lot of things. And I think what we're coming towards in our Act 2, which is like our Act 2 finale is coming up in Halloween. And what we're aiming for is to kind of shake Mary to her core. So that's like going to be a very exciting time for the story. Yeah.
Jesus. Mm-hmm. The real horror of Hainai. The horror of having to ask for help.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But also like, like that's kind of like Maddie's horror. She's like, she's very much she's so busy trying to help others that it's kind of just like, what'll happen if she has to have some help from other people and stuff is no longer within her control. How will that work?
None of us are ready. Okay.
It's true.
Well, thank you so much for coming on Radio Drama Revival. That's us.
Thank you for having me.
When you use the phrase like revival of radio drama, I was just like, so funny.
Exactly. Yeah, that was what I was thinking. As soon as I saw the name, I was like, it is literally the revival of radio drama, because all of my like older relatives are like, yeah, this is literally the radio dramas I listened to as a kid.
That's it.
That's freaking awesome. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed talking with you.
I really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you so much.
If you liked what you heard, you can support Hainai at www.patreon.com/HainaiPod. Radio Drama Revival runs on rewatching old comfort TV and day-old French fries. If you'd like to help keep us afloat and featuring new, diverse, unique fiction podcasts and their creators, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Radio Drama Revival. This episode was recorded in the unceded territory of the Kalapuya people, the Klitskani Indian tribe, the Cowlitz Indian tribe, and the Atfalati tribe. Colonizers named this place Beaverton, Oregon. Our theme music is Reunion of the Space Ducks by the band Kylo Kaz. You can find their music on Free Music Archive. Our audio producer is Will Williams. Our marketing manager and line producer is Ann Baird. Our researcher is Diane Tapia. Our submissions editor is Rishika Rao. Our associate marketing manager is Jillian Schrager. Our transcriptionist is Katie Yeomans. Our audio consultant is Eli Hamada McElveen. Our associate producer is Sean Howard. Our executive producers are Fred Greenhouse and David Reinstrom. Our mascot is Ticker Tape, the goat. I'm your host, Elena Fernández-Collins. This has been Radio Drama Revival. All storytellers welcome.